I am Kendra, 35 years old, and yesterday I inherited $22 million. Instead of celebrating the incredible lives of my grandparents, my mother threw me out into a freezing Atlanta downpour. She screamed that I was dead to them unless I handed over every penny to fund my white brother-in-law's failing tech startup. I simply picked up my ruined belongings, looked my family in the eye, and drove straight to the mansion they thought they owned. But what they did not know was that stepping into that house would give me the exact weapon I needed to send them to federal prison. Before I share how I dismantled their entire lives in under 24 hours, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family to protect your peace. The sound of my leather suitcase hitting the wet asphalt echoed through the affluent Atlanta suburb like a gunshot. It burst open on impact, scattering my tailored work blouses and expensive heels across the flooded driveway. I stood in this pouring rain, the icy water instantly soaking through my trench coat and completely ruining my silk press. But I did not move to gather my things. I kept my eyes locked on the front porch where my mother, Yvonne, stood perfectly dry under the shelter of the grand entryway. "You ungrateful, selfish little girl," Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking with a frantic rage. "I had known my entire life. You march back to that lawyer tomorrow morning, and you sign those estate documents over to us, or you are dead to this family. Do you hear me, Kendra? Dead to us." Standing silently behind her was my father, Tyrone. He wore his usual expression of manufactured disappointment, arms crossed tightly over his chest. Tyrone had never been a man of many words. His silence was the ultimate weapon he wielded to validate my mother's abuse. Growing up, whenever Yvonne tore down my achievements or belittled my ambitions, Tyrone simply looked away, cementing the reality that I had no protector in that house. I was the eldest daughter, the one expected to be strong, to pay my own way through college, to secure a demanding career as a senior financial auditor, and to never ask for a single dime. I stared at them through the sheet of rain. My grandparents, Harrison and Vivian, had perished in a devastating car crash just days prior. My heart was completely shattered. They were the only people who had ever truly loved me without conditions or hidden agendas. They were the ones who taught me the value of hard work, building their immense wealth from the ground up after my grandfather graduated from Morehouse College. Earlier that afternoon, we had all sat in their attorney's office to read the will. My family had arrived with barely concealed glee, whispering about how they would spend the fortune. But my grandfather was a meticulous, brilliant man. He saw right through their greed. The lawyer had dropped the bombshell that left my family gasping for air. The entire $22 million estate, including the liquid assets, the diverse stock portfolio, and the massive property in Buckhead, was left solely to me. Yvonne and Tyrone received absolutely nothing. As I stood in the driveway processing my mother's ultimatum, the front door swung wider. My younger sister Chloe stepped out holding a massive golf umbrella. She was wearing a designer cashmere coat that I knew for a fact my grandparents had paid for. Chloe had always been the pampered princess of the family, shielded from consequences and praised for simply existing. Flanking her was her husband, Liam, a white man whose arrogance was matched only by his profound professional incompetence. Kendra stopped being so hysterical. Liam scoffed, leaning against the doorframe as if he owned the place. He had the nerve to smirk at me while I stood freezing in the rain. We all know Harrison's mind was slipping at the end. "You just manipulated him because you are bitter." "I am not hysterical, Liam," I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain with absolute precision. "I am simply looking at a group of parasites who finally got cut off from their host." Chloe gasped dramatically, clutching Liam's arm as if I had physically struck her. "You have always been so jealous of me, Kendra. Just because you grind 60 hours a week at some boring audit firm does not mean you deserve Grandma and Grandpa's money. Liam is a visionary. He needs that capital for his startup. You are just a glorified calculator. You do not even know what to do with that kind of wealth." The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh out loud. As an auditor, I dealt in facts, and the facts regarding my brother-in-law were pathetic. Liam's tech startup had been bleeding money for 3 years. It was a running joke in Atlanta's business circles, a black hole of debt that produced absolutely zero user acquisition and no viable product. Yet, in my family's eyes, his failing vanity project was infinitely more important than my proven stable career. They viewed my grandparents' wealth as their personal piggy bank, a massive slush fund designed to finance Chloe's luxury shopping habits and keep Liam pretending to be a tech genius. You need to fix this, Kendra Ivan demanded, stepping closer to the edge of the porch, but careful not to let the rain touch her Italian leather shoes. You are going to transfer the funds to Liam's accounts by Friday. Family takes care of family. If you walk away tonight with our money, do not ever think about coming back to this house. I looked at the four of them standing there, a unified front of pure entitlement and toxicity. For 35 years, I had craved their validation. I had worked twice as hard, achieved twice as much, just hoping my mother would look at me with the same adoration she showered on Chloe. I had hoping my father would finally speak up and defend me just once, but standing in that storm, the illusion finally shattered completely. They did not love me. They only loved what they thought they could extract from me. I knelt down on the wet pavement. Slowly, methodically, I gathered my ruined blouses and soaked shoes, tossing them into the trunk of my car. I did not rush. I did not shed a single tear. My entire life was built on analyzing data, recognizing patterns, and making cold, hard calculations. The calculation here was simple. The cost of their love was my dignity, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I slammed the trunk shut and walked over to my driver's side door. I looked back at the porch, the smug confidence on Liam's face, the righteous indignation on Chloe's, the demanding, furious glare of my mother. "Keep the house, Mom," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion they could feed on. "I am keeping my inheritance." Yvonne shrieked my name as I got into my car and locked the doors. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life, drowning out the sound of my father finally yelling something from the porch. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the driveway without a second glance, leaving them standing in the damp, cold reality of their own making. The drive across Atlanta was a blur of neon lights and heavy rain. I turned the heater on high, shivering as the damp clothes clung to my skin, but my mind was laser-focused. I navigated the slick roads toward Buckhead, the wealthiest, most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The suffocating tension in my chest began to loosen with every mile that put distance between me and the people who shared my blood, but never my spirit. I pulled up to the imposing iron gates of my grandparents' estate. The property was massive, a sprawling architectural masterpiece, hidden behind towering oak trees and pristine landscaping. I rolled down my window and punched in the access code the lawyer had provided earlier that day. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, granting me entry into my new empire. I drove up the long, winding driveway and parked near the grand entrance. The $22 million mansion sat in total darkness, silent and intimidating, against the stormy night sky. I stepped out of my car, ignoring the rain that was still falling, and walked up the wide stone steps to the double mahogany doors. I slid the heavy brass key into the lock. The deadbolt gave way with a satisfying heavy click. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the faint, comforting scent of my grandmother's lavender perfume and my grandfather's rich cedarwood cologne. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the screaming and chaos I had just left behind. I reached for the wall panel and flipped the switch. A massive crystal chandelier flared to life overhead, illuminating the sweeping dual staircase and the imported marble floors. I stood there dripping wet in the center of the foyer, completely alone, but profoundly powerful. I did not collapse on the floor and weep. I did not allow myself to break down. My grandfather was a man who operated on logic, strategy, and foresight. He was a brilliant businessman who scrutinized every detail of his life and his company. He did not cut his only daughter and his favored granddaughter out of his will, simply out of spite or a sudden change of heart. There was a puzzle here, a hidden truth that he had intentionally left for me to find. I stripped off my soaked trench coat, leaving it in a heap on the marble floor. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to look. I bypassed the luxurious living spaces and headed straight down the long, shadowed hallway toward my grandfather's private study. The real battle had not even begun, but I was already preparing my weapons, standing in the center of that cavernous, silent study, the sheer weight of my new reality settling over my shoulders. My mind was violently pulled back to how this entire war had been ignited just 12 hours earlier. The scent of polished leather and aged paper in the mansion perfectly matched the heavy air in the downtown office of my grandparents' attorney. Reginald was a sharp, distinguished man who had been my grandfather's legal counsel and closest confidant for over 30 years. Earlier that morning, My entire family had crowded into his mahogany-lined conference room for the reading of the will. I was sitting in the corner chair, clutching a crumpled tissue, my eyes still swollen from crying myself to sleep the night before. I was drowning in a very real, very suffocating grief. My grandparents were gone. The two people who had attended every single one of my college graduations when my parents claimed they were too busy were gone forever. But the atmosphere in the rest of the room was anything but sorrowful. It was thick with a manufactured grief that barely concealed a palpable restless greed. Liam was pacing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, loudly discussing his groundbreaking tech application. He was bragging to my father about how he was ready for a $3 million seed injection from the estate to finally launch his platform. I watched him wave his hands around, acting as though the money was already sitting in his bank account. Beside him, Chloe was actively scrolling through luxury real estate listings on her phone, not even pretending to mourn. She occasionally leaned over to show our mother a beachfront property in Miami, whispering about how she could finally afford a summer home. Yvonne simply nodded, adjusting her pearls and complaining to my father about how long the legal process was taking because she wanted to remodel their kitchen before the holidays. Tyrone sat with his arms crossed, projecting an air of absolute authority, fully expecting to inherit the lion's share of his parents' empire. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. They were not mourning the loss of a father and mother. They were eagerly awaiting a massive payout. Reginald entered the room, his expression unreadable. He took his seat at the head of the heavy oak table and opened the sealed leather folder. He offered his condolences, his voice gentle when he looked at me before clearing his throat to read the final wishes of Harrison and Vivian. I expected my parents to get the bulk of the estate. I expected Chloe to be handed a massive trust fund. I had prepared myself to receive a modest sum, perhaps enough to pay off my mortgage, because that was the dynamic I had accepted my entire life. But my grandfather was a man who saw everything. He built his wealth block by block in Atlanta, and he refused to let fools dismantle his legacy. Reginald Reed, the preamble, then delivered the financial distribution. To his only son, Tyrone, and his daughter-in-law, Yvonne Harrison, left absolutely nothing. To his youngest granddaughter, Chloe, he left absolutely nothing. The room went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the thick carpet. Liam stopped pacing. Chloe lowered her phone. My mother stared at the attorney as if he had just slapped her across the face. Reginald did not pause. He continued reading with clear, deliberate articulation. The entire $22 million estate was left solely to me. Every single penny, the liquid assets spread across multiple banking institutions, the highly diversified corporate stock portfolio, the commercial real estate holdings in downtown Atlanta, and the crown jewel of the estate, the sprawling Buckhead mansion. It was all legally, undeniably, and entirely mine. For 10 seconds, the silence was absolute. I sat frozen in my chair, the words echoing in my mind. $22 million, complete control. My grandparents had bypassed my parents entirely, cutting off the golden child and her entitled husband, and handed the keys to the kingdom to the one person they knew would protect it. Then the explosion happened. Yvonne lost her mind. She shot up from her chair, her voice scaling to a shrill, hysterical pitch. She pointed a trembling finger at me, accusing me of manipulating her parents in their final days. She screamed that I had always been a calculating, greedy girl playing the beautiful granddaughter just to worm my way into their bank accounts. She yelled that I had brainwashed them while they were vulnerable. I sat there watching the woman who gave birth to me unravel completely. She did not shed a single tear for her deceased parents, but she was sobbing over the loss of their money. Tyrone slammed his hands on the table, leaning aggressively toward the attorney. He demanded that Reginald throw the document out immediately. He claimed the will had to be a forgery, a mistake, or the product of severe mental decline. He threatened to sue the firm to tie the estate up in probate court for a decade and to ruin Reginald's career if he did not fix this error. But it was Liam who reacted the most violently. The facade of the polite progressive son-in-law vanished instantly. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany table so hard the coffee cups rattled. He started shouting, his voice echoing with absolute entitlement. He claimed he had a verbal contract with my grandfather. He screamed that Harrison had personally promised him a $3 million investment just last month and that I had stolen his rightful funding. Liam paced around the table, threatening to sue me personally for breach of contract. calling me a corporate drone who had no idea how to manage that level of capital. Chloe joined in crying loud, dramatic tears, claiming that I was ruining her future. She yelled that I was a bitter, lonely woman trying to destroy her marriage by withholding the money Liam rightfully earned. I watched them all. I watched them scream, threaten, and demand. As a senior financial audit, my entire career was built on analyzing data, identifying discrepancies, and remaining entirely objective in high-stress environments. In that moment, I analyzed my family, and the equation was sickeningly clear. They felt completely entitled to a fortune they did not earn, and they were furious that the one person they deemed inferior held all the power. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my character or explain my grief. I did not engage with Liam's childish tantrums or my mother's vicious accusations. I simply stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I walked over to the head of the table where Reginald sat quietly observing the chaos. "Reginald," I said, my voice cutting through their screaming with chilling composure. "Do you have the keys to the Buckhead property?" My mother stopped yelling. Liam froze. They stared at me in total disbelief. "Yes," Kendra Reginald replied, a faint hint of respect in his eyes. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy set of brass keys on a silver ring. He slid them across the polished wood. I picked up the keys. The metallic clink sounded incredibly loud in the sudden silence of the room. I looked directly at Liam, whose face was twitching with rage. Then I looked at my mother, whose eyes were wide with shock. "Thank you, Reginald," I said clearly. "I will be in touch tomorrow to begin the asset transfer process." I turned and walked out of the office, the sound of my heels clicking steadily against the hardwood floor. I did not look back as the screaming erupted again, twice as loud and twice as vicious. My absolute refusal to argue my sheer composure in the face of their fury was the ultimate insult to their egos. I knew in that moment I had ignited a war that directly led to my violent eviction later that night. But as I stood in my grandfather's study 12 hours later, holding the keys to the empire they desperately wanted, I knew they had vastly underestimated the woman they had thrown out into the rain. My grandparents left me their $22 million estate, completely cutting out my parents and my golden child sister. When I refused to sign my inheritance over to fund my white brother-in-law's failing tech startup, my own mother threw my bags into the freezing rain and told me I was dead to the family. I simply smiled, picked up my ruined clothes, and drove straight to the mansion they thought they owned. I had no idea that unlocking the doors to that estate would hand me the exact evidence I needed to send my entire family to federal prison. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace, hit like and subscribe, and let me tell you how I dismantled their fake empire in under 24 hours. The sound of my heavy leather suitcase slamming against the wet asphalt echoed like a gunshot through the affluent Atlanta suburb. The zipper burst upon impact, scattering my tailored work blouses, skirts, and expensive heels across the flooded driveway. I stood in the pouring rain, the icy water instantly soaking through my wool trench coat and completely ruining my silk press. But I did not move to gather my belongings. I kept my eyes locked on the front porch where my mother, Yvonne, stood perfectly dry under the shelter of the grandstone entryway. "You ungrateful, selfish little girl," Yvonne screamed, her voice cracking with a frantic, unhinged rage I had known my entire life. "You march back to that lawyer tomorrow morning and you sign those estate documents over to us, or you are dead to this family. Do you hear me, Kendra? Dead to us." Standing silently behind her was my father, Tyrone. He wore his usual expression of manufactured disappointment, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Tyrone had never been a man of many words. His silence was the ultimate weapon he wielded to validate my mother's emotional abuse. Growing up, whenever Yvonne tore down my achievements or belittled my ambitions, Tyrone simply looked away, cementing the reality that I had no protector in that house. I was the eldest daughter, the one expected to be strong, to pay my own way through college, to secure a demanding career as a senior financial auditor, and to never ever ask for a single dime. I stared at them through the sheet of rain, my heart completely shattered. My grandparents, Harrison and Vivian, had perished in a devastating car crash just days prior. They were the only people in my life who had ever truly loved me without conditions or hidden agendas. They were the ones who taught me the value of hard work, building their immense wealth from the ground up after my grandfather graduated from Morehouse College. Earlier that afternoon, we had all sat in their attorney's office for the reading of the will. My family had arrived with barely concealed glee, whispering loudly about how they would spend the fortune. But my grandfather was a meticulous, brilliant man who saw right through their greed. The lawyer had dropped the bombshell that left my family gasping for air. The entire $22 million estate, including the liquid assets, the diverse stock portfolio, and the massive property in Buckhead, was left solely to me. Yvonne and Tyrone received absolutely nothing. As I stood in the driveway processing my mother's furious ultimatum, the front door swung wider. My younger sister, Chloe, stepped out holding a massive golf umbrella. She was wearing a designer cashmere coat that I knew for a fact my grandparents had paid for. Chloe had always been the pampered princess of the family, shielded from consequences and praised for simply existing. Flanking her was her husband, Liam, a white man whose arrogance was matched only by his profound professional incompetence. Kendra stopped being so hysterical. Liam scoffed, leaning against the doorframe as if he owned the place. He had the nerve to smirk at me while I stood freezing in the rain. We all know Harrison's mind was slipping at the end. You just manipulated him because you are bitter. I am not hysterical, Liam, I said, my voice cutting through the sound of the rain with absolute precision. I am simply looking at a group of parasites who finally got cut off from their host. Chloe gasped, dramatically clutching Liam's arm, as if I had physically struck her. You have always been so jealous of me, Kendra. Just because you grind 60 hours a week at some boring audit firm does not mean you deserve Grandma and Grandpa's money. Liam is a visionary. He needs that capital for his startup. You are just a glorified calculator. You do not even know what to do with that kind of wealth. The sheer audacity of her statement almost made me laugh out loud. As a financial auditor, I dealt in facts, and the facts regarding my brother-in-law were pathetic. Liam's tech startup had been bleeding money for 3 years. It was a running joke in Atlanta's business circles, a black hole of debt that produced absolutely zero user acquisition and no viable product. Yet, in my family's eyes, his failing vanity project was infinitely more important than my proven stable career. They viewed my grandparents' wealth as their personal piggy bank, a massive slush fund designed to finance Chloe's luxury shopping habits and keep Liam pretending to be a tech genius. You need to fix this, Kendra Yvonne demanded, stepping closer to the edge of the porch, but careful not to let the rain touch her Italian leather shoes. You are going to transfer the funds to Liam's accounts by Friday. Family takes care of family. If you walk away tonight with our money, do not ever think about coming back to this house. I looked at the 4 of them standing there, a unified front of pure entitlement and toxicity. For 35 years, I had craved their validation. I had worked twice as hard, achieved twice as much, just hoping my mother would look at me with the same adoration she showered on Chloe. I had hoped my father would finally speak up and defend me just once, but standing in that storm, the illusion finally shattered completely. They did not love me. They only loved what they thought they could extract from me. I knelt down on the wet pavement. Slowly, methodically, I gathered my ruined blouses and soaked shoes, tossing them into the trunk of my car. I did not rush. I did not shed a single tear. My entire life was built on analyzing data, recognizing patterns, and making cold, hard calculations. The calculation here was simple. The cost of their love was my dignity, and I was no longer willing to pay it. I slammed the trunk shut and walked over to my driver's side door. I looked back at the porch, the smug confidence on Liam's face, the righteous indignation on Chloe's, the demanding, furious glare of my mother. Keep the house, Mom, I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion they could feed on. I am keeping my inheritance. Yvonne shrieked my name as I got into my car and locked the doors. I turned the ignition, the engine roaring to life, drowning out the sound of my father finally yelling something from the porch. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the driveway without a second glance, leaving them standing in the damp, cold reality of their own making. The drive across Atlanta was a blur of neon lights and heavy rain. I turned the heater on high, shivering as the damp clothes clung to my skin, but my mind was laser-focused. I navigated the slick roads toward Buckhead, the wealthiest, most exclusive neighborhood in the city. The suffocating tension in my chest began to loosen with every mile that put distance between me and the people who shared my blood, but never my spirit. I was driving straight to my grandparents' vacant $22 million estate, and I knew with absolute certainty that tonight was only the beginning of a war. They thought they could bully me into submission, but they had vastly underestimated the woman they had just thrown out into the rain. I walked into my grandfather's private study and closed the heavy oak door behind me. The room smelled of old paper, expensive leather, and the faint, lingering scent of his favorite cigars. It was a space designed for serious business, a sanctuary where he had managed the wealth he built from scratch. I did not waste time looking through the obvious filing cabinets or the pristine desk drawers. My grandfather was a meticulous man who trusted very few people, and as a senior financial auditor, I knew exactly how men like him operated. I walked straight over to the large Persian rug occupying the center of the room. I rolled the heavy fabric back, revealing the smooth hardwood floor and the subtle, nearly invisible seam of a floor safe. I used to watch him open it when I was a teenager, back when I would sit in this very room and let him teach me about compound interest and asset protection. I knelt on the floor and dialed the combination from memory. The heavy steel mechanism gave way with a satisfying click. I pulled the heavy door open and reached inside. There were stacks of property deeds and old family photographs, but my hands bypassed them to grab the one item that felt out of place. It was a thick black leather-bound ledger. I carried it over to his desk, turned on the brass reading lamp, and opened the heavy cover. What I saw inside made the blood run absolutely cold in my veins. This was not a standard accounting book. It was a forensic trail. My grandfather had been conducting his own private audit for the last 8 months of his life. The pages were filled with his neat, precise handwriting, tracking a massive, unauthorized hemorrhaging of funds from his secondary commercial real estate accounts. Millions of dollars were simply missing. I sat down in his leather chair and followed the money trail, my eyes scanning the attached bank statements and printed wire transfers. The funds were not just disappearing into thin air, they were being actively and systematically siphoned. The recipient accounts were tied to a series of obscure offshore limited liability companies. I flipped to the back flap of the ledger and pulled out the corporate registry documents my grandfather had managed to acquire. I cross-referenced the company names. Every single offshore account traced back to one person, Liam. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Liam's tech startup was not just failing, it was a massive financial sinkhole. He was drowning in fraudulent loans, unpaid vendors, and desperate investors looking for their returns. To save his precious white son-in-law from a federal prison sentence, and to protect the obscenely lavish lifestyle, my sister Chloe demanded my own father had intervened. The ledger contained copies of internal authorization forms from the family business. Tyrone had been forging my grandfather's signature. My father, a man who stood tall in his tailored suits and preached about integrity to his Atlanta church congregation every single Sunday, had been bleeding his own parents dry. He had facilitated the theft of nearly $4 million. And my mother, Yvonne, the woman who cared so deeply about our family's pristine social image and her luxury country club memberships, was not an innocent bystander. Attached emails and bank routing numbers showed she had been moving money through her personal accounts to help wash the stolen funds clean before they reached Liam. They were all in on it, every single one of them. The breath caught in my throat as the sheer audacity of their greed washed over me. My grandparents had figured it all out. They did not just cut my parents and Chloe out of the will out of spite or disappointment. They were actively trying to protect the remainder of the empire they had spent their entire lives building. I flipped to the very last page of the thick ledger. Tucked inside a clear plastic sleeve was a drafted, unfiled police report alongside a formal letter addressed to the district attorney of Fulton County. My grandfather had meticulously laid out the entire embezzlement and forgery scheme, naming Liam, Tyrone, and Yvonne as the primary perpetrators. I checked the date on the drafted letter. It was written exactly 4 days before the fatal car crash that took their lives. My stomach churned with a dark, suffocating nausea. They were going to turn my parents and Liam into the authorities the very week they died. The police had ruled the car crash a tragic accident due to slick roads and heavy rain. But staring at the evidence in my hands, the timing felt like a heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on my chest. They betrayed the very people who gave them everything. They stole from the man who built a legacy for our family to thrive. And then, less than 24 hours ago, they threw me out into the freezing rain for refusing to blindly hand over the rest of the pie. The absolute arrogance of it was sickening. But the overwhelming grief I felt for my grandparents was instantly pushed aside, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. As a financial auditor, finding the discrepancy is only step 1. Step 2 is building the case. And step 3 is holding the guilty parties accountable. I pulled out my phone and immediately began taking high-resolution pictures of every single page, every wire transfer, and every forged signature. I uploaded the files directly to my secure encrypted cloud storage. I was gathering my ammunition, ensuring that no matter what happened to the physical ledger, the truth would survive. I was just photographing the final draft of the police report when a loud, piercing siren shattered the silence of the mansion. The perimeter security alarm was blaring a harsh mechanical screaming that echoed down the quiet hallways. I jumped up from the desk and rushed over to the security monitor mounted on the study wall. I checked the timestamp on the screen. It was exactly 8 inches the morning. I stared at the high-definition camera feed displaying the main entrance of the property. A convoy of 3 black sport utility vehicles had just aggressively breached the front iron gates of the estate. They were speeding up the long, winding driveway, tearing through the pristine landscaping. My family had not waited for me to process my grief. They had come to take what they believed was theirs. The piercing shriek of the perimeter security alarm echoed through the cavernous halls of the Buckhead estate, vibrating violently against the imported hardwood floors beneath my feet. I did not flinch. I did not jump. I simply closed the heavy leather cover of my grandfather's ledger, safely tucking it into my briefcase. Through the high-defined security monitors mounted on the study wall, I watched 3 black sport utility vehicles tear up the pristine manicured driveway. They had not just bypassed the main iron gates. They had rammed right through them, tearing the metal off the hinges and destroying the beautiful landscaping my grandmother had spent years perfecting. The blatant disrespect for the property told me everything I needed to know about their state of mind. They were desperate. I walked out of the study, my footsteps steady and deliberate against the marble floors of the grand hallway. I climbed the sweeping dual staircase to the 2nd floor and stepped out onto the expansive master balcony. The crisp morning air hit my face, a stark contrast to the humid, miserable rainstorm from the night before. I looked down at the vast courtyard. My family had arrived, and they had brought an absolute circus with them. Liam stepped out of the lead vehicle, puffing his chest out like a conqueror claiming a new territory. His tailored suit looked ridiculous as he stomped across the gravel. My younger sister Chloe scrambled out behind him, clutching a designer handbag, looking around the massive property with hungry, wide eyes. She was already treating the $22 million estate like her personal shopping cart. Then came my parents. Ivan and Tyrone emerged from the 2nd vehicle, their faces twisted into identical masks of self-righteous anger. But they were not alone. From the 3rd vehicle poured 4 massive men in tactical gear. Clearly a privately hired security firm meant to look intimidating. And standing right beside Liam, adjusting his utility belt with an arrogant swagger, was an unformed off-duty county deputy. I knew exactly who he was. Liam used to brag at our family dinners about a local deputy he kept on his payroll to make his minor traffic violations and public intoxication charges magically disappear. Now he was using his bought and paid-for muscle to intimidate me out of my own home. Liam reached into the front seat of his vehicle and pulled out a bright red megaphone. He pointed it directly at the 2nd-floor windows, completely unaware that I was already standing quietly on the balcony just above him. "Kendra, come out here right now." His voice boomed, artificially amplified and dripping with the kind of arrogant condescension only a mediocre white man propped up by stolen money could muster. "We know you are in there. The game is over." I leaned against the cool stone balustrade, looking down at the pathetic assembly. "What game is that, Liam?" I called out, my voice projecting clearly over the courtyard without the need for any megaphone. "The one where you pretend to be a successful tech founder while secretly draining an old man's bank accounts." Liam lowered the megaphone for a fraction of a second, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He quickly raised it back to his mouth, waving a thick stack of printed papers in his other hand. "I have an emergency injunction right here signed by a judge at 7 this morning. It grants me immediate, temporary conservatorship of this entire estate. You are mentally unstable, Kendra. We have filed formal reports claiming you committed elder fraud manipulating Harrison in his final days. You are legally barred from this property." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were projecting their exact crimes onto me. Ivan stepped forward, shoving past the private security guards, pointing a manicured finger up at the balcony. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little thief," she screamed, her voice cracking with a frantic desperation. "You are going to walk out that front door right now and hand over the estate keys to Liam. We are giving you exactly 5 minutes. If you do not open that door, the deputy here is going to arrest you for criminal trespassing and breaking into a sealed crime scene." Tyrone stood silently behind her, shaking his head, playing the role of the heartbroken, exhausted patriarch. My father, the man who preached honesty to his congregation every Sunday, was standing shoulder to shoulder with the man he helped steal $4 million for. Chloe crossed her arms, shivering slightly in the morning chill, looking completely bored by the destruction of our family. "Just give it up, Kendra," Chloe yelled, her voice whiny and deeply entitled. "You are embarrassing yourself. Liam is taking over the estate management today. Just leave quietly so we can start planning the renovations. They need to gut that awful kitchen before I host my summer gala." I looked down at the five of them, truly studying the dynamic playing out in my driveway. They were absolutely terrified. They were operating on pure panic and unearned confidence. Liam needed immediate access to the house to scrub any remaining physical evidence of his embezzlement before the estate went through probate. Yvonne and Tyrone needed me out of the picture before I could audit the commercial accounts and discover the forged signatures my father had been executing. They brought a fake injunction, a corrupt deputy, and a rent-a-cop security team to bully me into submission because bullying was the only tactic that had ever worked on me in the past. They expected the old Kendra. They expected the beautiful, quiet daughter who would crumble under the weight of my mother's screaming and my father's heavy weaponized disappointment. They expected me to look at the badge on the deputy's uniform, panic about losing my professional auditing license over a fake arrest record, and surrender the keys just to avoid a public scene. They thought I was a terrified, isolated woman cornered in a massive empty house with no way out. What they did not know was that I had spent the last several hours reading every single page of my grandfather's hidden ledger. They did not know that I had already photographed every forged wire transfer, every fraudulent corporate document, and the drafted police report that proved my grandparents knew exactly who was stealing from them. And most importantly, as Liam smugly tapped his expensive watch and yelled through the megaphone that my 5 minutes were officially ticking down, they had absolutely no idea who I had called at 3:00 the morning. I stepped back from the balcony window and took a deep breath. The cool air of the empty mansion filled my lungs. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear. I simply turned around and made my way down the sweeping marble staircase. My heels clicked in a steady, rhythmic cadence against the imported stone floors. Outside, the muffled sound of Liam shouting through his megaphone vibrated against the thick, reinforced glass of the mahogany front doors. He was counting down the minutes, fully believing he held all the power. I walked directly to the grand foyer. Mounted on the wall next to the entrance was the estate security panel. My grandfather had upgraded the entire system just last year. It was a commercial-grade setup with high-definition cameras covering every inch of the perimeter and a crystal-clear two-way audio intercom. I reached out and pressed the communication button. "Liam," I said, my voice projected from the exterior speakers ringing out across the driveway with absolute clarity. It cut right through his amplified shouting. Liam lowered his megaphone. I watched him on the security monitor. He looked up at the door as a smug, victorious grin spreading across his face. "It is about time," Kendra, Liam yelled back. He stepped closer to the door, waving the stack of papers in his hand. "Open up. The deputy is losing his patience, and I have contractors waiting to evaluate the property. You have dragged this out long enough." "I am not opening the door, Liam," I replied calmly. The smile vanished from his face. Yvonne marched up right beside him, her face twisted in rage. "Kendra, you open this door right now," my mother screamed. "You are making a fool of yourself. You are embarrassing this family in front of the authorities. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I pressed the button again. "I need to verify that supposed injunction with my legal counsel," I stated. "You can stand out there in the cold until my attorney reviews the document. Until then, anyone who steps foot on this porch is trespassing." Liam laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound. He turned to the corrupt county deputy standing behind him and shook his head, acting as if I was just a hysterical woman having a breakdown. "You do not have legal counsel," Kendra, Liam sneered into the intercom. "You are a glorified bean counter. You do not have the resources or the authority to fight me on this." The judge signed the order. "Your father and mother signed the affidavit testifying to your mental instability. We own the situation. Now, open the door before we break it down." This was the moment. As a senior financial auditor, I spent my entire career sitting across from arrogant men who thought they could hide their financial crimes behind loud voices and intimidation tactics. I knew exactly how to dismantle a fragile ego. Liam was a failed white tech bro who felt entirely entitled to black wealth. He hated that I, a self-sufficient black woman, was the only obstacle standing between him and his stolen fortune. I knew if I pushed the right button, His arrogance would override his common sense. "Why do you need this house so desperately, Liam?" I asked, letting a tone of mocking pity slip into my voice. "Is the startup failing that hard?" I heard. "You have not secured a single user in 3 years. Are the investors finally breathing down your neck?" Through the high-define monitor, I watched the color drain from Liam's face. The insult hit him exactly where he was weakest. His entire identity was wrapped up in pretending to be a Silicon Valley genius. Chloe stepped forward, grabbing Liam's arm. "Do not listen to her, Liam. She is just jealous. She has always been jealous of us." But Liam shook her off. His face turned a deep, blotchy red. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive collar. He stepped right up to the intercom speaker, his eyes wild with fury. "You have no idea what you are talking about, you pathetic corporate drone," Liam shouted, his voice echoing off the stone pillars of the entryway. "My company is on the verge of a major breakthrough. I am managing millions of dollars. Your father handed me the reins to the family assets months ago because he knows I actually have vision." I leaned closer to the microphone. "What assets?" "Liam," I asked coolly. "My grandfather cut you out. You have nothing. I have everything." Liam screamed, completely losing control. He pointed a finger at the door as if he could strike me through the wood. "I already control the commercial accounts. Tyrone gave me the authorization. I have been moving the capital for 8 months. I manage the offshore limited liability companies. I manage the real estate funds. I built the financial structure that is keeping your parents afloat right now. You think a stupid piece of paper from a dead man changes anything? I already took the money, Kendra. I own this family. You cannot stop me." Yvonne suddenly lunged forward and grabbed Liam's shoulder, her eyes wide with sudden, terrifying realization. She tried to pull him back from the speaker, hissing at him to shut his mouth. She knew he had just said too much. Tyrone stepped forward as well, his face suddenly pale, realizing his son-in-law had just openly bragged about their illegal financial maneuvers in front of a county deputy. But the deputy did not seem to care. He was on Liam's payroll, paid to look the other way and enforce their will. He just stood there, bored and waiting for his money. Liam shoved my mother's hand away, completely blinded by his need to put me in my place. He leaned back into the intercom. "You are nothing, Kendra," Liam spat. "You sit in a cubicle and count other people's money. I move millions across the globe. I am the reason Chloe lives in a mansion. I am the reason your parents have their country club memberships. I did what Tyrone was too scared to do on his own. I took the capital so you can hide in there with your little accounting degrees all you want. I am taking this house today and I am taking everything inside it." I took my finger off the communication button. I did not need to say another word. I looked at the digital display on the security panel. A small red light was blinking steadily in the corner of the screen. The estate security system was directly wired into a secure server. Every single word of Liam's arrogant, unhinged confession had been recorded in crystal-clearer, high-define audio. He had just publicly admitted to controlling the commercial accounts. He had admitted to moving the capital for 8 months. He had admitted to managing the offshore companies that I had found in my grandfather's ledger. He had verbally validated every single forged wire transfer and fraudulent document sitting in my briefcase. I thought he was intimidating me. He thought he was proving his dominance. Instead, he had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of evidence I needed to lock him in a federal prison cell for the next decade. And he had dragged my father directly into the confession. I smiled. It was a cold, sharp smile. The trap had sprung perfectly. They were so blinded by their greed and their disdain for me that they forgot I made a living out of catching thieves. I picked up my coffee cup from the console table and took a slow, deliberate sip. Outside, Liam was yelling at the private security guards, ordering them to retrieve the heavy metal tools from the trunks of the sport utility vehicles. "Break the door down," my father suddenly yelled, his voice cracking with a new panicked urgency. He wanted me silenced. He wanted the house breached before I could do any damage. I stood in the quiet foyer, listening to the heavy footsteps of the hired muscle approaching the porch. The true war was about to begin, but I was holding all the ammunition. The heavy footsteps of the hired muscle stopped just short of the porch steps. Through the high-definition security monitor, I watched the private guards hesitate, glancing back at my father for final confirmation before causing severe property damage to a $22 million estate. Before Tyrone could issue the command, Chloe shoved her way through the group. Her designer cashmere coat was now splattered with mud from the ruined driveway, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to frizz in the damp morning air. She marched directly up to the exterior intercom panel and slammed her palm against the call button. When her voice filtered through the interior speakers, the entitled whining tone was completely gone. In its place was a shaky, tearful pitch that she had perfected since we were children. It was the exact voice she used whenever she wrecked one of my parents' luxury cars or failed a college course. The voice designed to instantly cast her as a helpless victim and whoever stood in her way as the cruel aggressor. "Kendra, please just stop doing this," Chloe pleaded, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the grand foyer. "You are acting completely unhinged. You have always wanted to ruin my happiness, but this is going too far. I know you resent me. I know you have always been jealous that Mom and Dad loved me more, that Liam chose me instead of some boring woman who only cares about spreadsheets. But you cannot punish my husband just because you are bitter and alone." I stood in the center of the foyer, holding my coffee cup, simply observing her distorted face on the security screen. Her ability to center herself in a situation involving grand larceny and elder abuse was genuinely pathological. "If you do not open this door right now," Chloe continued her tone, shifting from fake sorrow to a vicious, venomous threat, "I am calling my contacts at the local news stations. I know half the social bloggers in Atlanta. I will tell them that you locked yourself in our dead grandfather's house. I will tell them you are having a psychotic break because you could not handle the grief. Your accounting firm will see it on the evening news. They will fire you before noon. You will lose your certified public accountant license. You will lose your entire career, Kendra. Do not test me." She stared into the camera, breathing heavily, fully, believing she had just delivered a checkmate. She thought my career was my vulnerability, because it was the only thing I had ever fought to protect. She assumed the threat of public humiliation would bring me to my knees, because public image was the only currency our family valued. I pressed the communication button. My voice was calm, icy, and totally devoid of the panic she desperately wanted to hear. "You cannot destroy a reputation built on facts with a foundation of lies, Chloe," I replied. "You can call every news station in Fulton County. You can tell them whatever fairy tale helps you sleep at night. But when the reporters show up, they are not going to be investigating my mental health. They are going to be investigating why the wife of a failed tech founder knowingly co-signed dozens of fraudulent offshore wire transfers to fund her luxury shopping sprees." I watched Chloe freeze on the monitor. The color drained from her face so fast she looked physically ill. She stumbled backward, her hand dropping from the intercom button. I had just confirmed that I did not just suspect them, I had the exact financial receipts. Before Chloe could say another word, Yvonne forcefully pushed her daughter aside. My mother stepped up to the camera. The furious, screaming woman from the driveway was gone. She had seamlessly transitioned into her role as the dignified, long-suffering matriarch. She pressed the button, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with manufactured heartbreak and crocodile tears. "Kendra, sweetheart, please listen to me," Yvonne begged, placing her hand over her heart. "We are a prominent Black family in this city. Your grandfather worked too hard, marched in the streets, and built our name from the ground up for you to tear it all down over a simple financial misunderstanding. Do not do this to our community. Do not invite the police and the media into our private business. We can handle this internally. We can fix whatever Liam did. But if you do not open that door and let us manage this, you are committing treason against your own blood. You are destroying our legacy." I felt a surge of absolute disgust rise in my chest. I had spent 35 years watching my mother manipulate every situation to her advantage. But this was a new low. She was weaponizing our racial identity, twisting the very real concept of Black family unity to protect a white man who was actively stealing from them. She was using my grandfather's hard-fought legacy as a shield for her own greed. I pressed the button, my grip on the console, tightening until my knuckles turned white, protecting the family name. "Mom," I asked, letting the full weight of my contempt bleed into the microphone. "Is that what you call helping a mediocre white man steal $4 million from your own father? You let a parasite drain a fortune built by a Black man who sacrificed everything, and you want to lecture me about legacy. You are using Black excellence as a human shield for your own crimes. You did not care about the family name when you helped wash those stolen funds through your personal checking accounts. You did not care about family unity when you forged the internal authorization forms to cover Liam's tracks." The silence outside was deafening. Yvonne physically recoiled from the intercom, her hands dropping to her sides. She looked back at Tyrone, her eyes wide with sheer unadulterated terror. She finally realized the scope of the disaster. I did not just have Liam's confession. I knew about her specific involvement. I knew about the washed funds. I knew about the forged authorization forms. Tyrone's face twisted into a mask of pure panic. The quiet, passive enabler realized that his own freedom was on the line. He knew that talking to me was useless. He knew that every second they wasted standing in that driveway gave me more time to secure the evidence against him. The illusion of a peaceful resolution was dead. "That is enough." Tyrone's voice cracked over the speaker, raw, desperate, and stripped of all his usual polished authority. He marched forward, shoving my mother and sister behind him. He turned to Liam and the private security team standing nervously near the steps. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the heavy mahogany doors. "Get the crowbars," Tyrone ordered, his voice escalating into a frantic shout. "5 minutes are up. Break the door down right now. Break it down." The intercom feed cut to a sharp, static hiss as my father terminated the connection. The sudden silence inside the grand foyer was deafening, a stark contrast to the aggressive chaos brewing just outside my front door. I stood perfectly still on the imported marble floor. My eyes locked on the thick frosted glass sidelights that flanked the massive mahogany double doors. Through the blurred, textured glass, I could see the distorted, shifting silhouettes of the men moving up the wide stone steps of the porch. I watched the tallest silhouette push his way to the front of the pack. It was Liam. Even through the frosted glass, I recognized his aggressive, erratic posture. He snatched a heavy steel crowbar from one of the private security guards. I could hear the harsh scrape of the metal as he tested its weight in his hands. Liam was absolutely vibrating with adrenaline. He was not just executing my father's desperate orders. He was thoroughly enjoying this. For 3 years, I had been the only person in this family who refused to applaud his terrible business pitches. I was the only one who looked at his tech startup and called it exactly what it was, a financial sinkhole managed by a man with zero actual talent. He hated me for it. He hated that a self-sufficient black woman saw right through his unearned white mediocrity. To him, breaking down my door was not just about securing the stolen funds. It was about putting the independent sister back in her place. He thought this was his moment of ultimate triumph. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of their boots on the front porch. Chloe was right behind him, her voice shrill and muffled through the thick wood, telling him to aim for the brass lock plate so they would not ruin the custom woodwork. She was already treating the $22 million estate as her personal property, casually directing the destruction of our grandfather's home, as if she were ordering a renovation. Ivan and Tyrone hovered in the background, a pair of cowards hiding behind the hired muscle they had brought to do their dirty work. They expected me to be cowering on the other side of the door. They expected me to be frantically dialing the local police, completely unaware that the off-duty county deputy standing on my porch was already on Liam's payroll. They thought I was trapped, panicking, and frantically searching for a way out of the mansion. But I did not panic. Panic is an emotion reserved for people who do not know the numbers, and as a senior financial auditor, I always knew the numbers. I knew exactly how many millions they had stolen. I knew exactly which offshore accounts the money was sitting in, and most importantly, I knew exactly who was waiting in the shadows of the mansion right behind me. I lifted the porcelain cup from the console table and took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was bitter and grounding. I set the cup down gently, ensuring it did not make a single sound against the polished wood. I turned to face the tall mirror hanging in the entryway to check my reflection. I was not the soaked, devastated girl they had thrown out into the freezing rain just 12 hours ago. I was not wearing sweatpants or looking defeated. I had showered in my grandmother's luxurious suite, wrapped my hair in a sleek, immaculate bun, and put on a sharply tailored charcoal gray business blazer. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket with steady hands. I adjusted my cuffs. I looked flawless, professional, and entirely unbothered. I was stepping into my role not just as the sole heir to this empire, but as the executioner of their toxic reign outside. Liam slammed the head of the crowbar against the stone pillar of the porch. A loud ringing crack meant to intimidate me. "Stand back!" Kendra Liam shouted through the heavy wood, his voice dripping with venomous glee. "We are coming in. You brought this on yourself." I took a deep breath. The faint scent of my grandfather's cedarwood cologne lingering in the foyer air, giving me an anchor of absolute strength. I walked right up to the heavy double doors. I did not hesitate. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the cold, heavy brass deadbolt. With one swift, forceful motion, I turned the lock. The sharp, heavy click of the deadbolt disengaging echoed loudly. The sound instantly silenced the commotion on the porch. The murmuring stopped. The shifting boots paused. They knew I was standing right on the other side. I grabbed the brass handles and pulled the massive mahogany doors inward, throwing them wide open to the morning air. The sudden flood of natural light illuminated the grand foyer. Liam was standing barely 2 feet away, positioned right at the threshold. He had the heavy steel crowbar raised halfway to his shoulder, his knuckles white from gripping the metal. His chest was puffed out, his face flushed red with exertion and arrogant pride. Chloe stood just over his shoulder. A vicious, triumphant smirk plastered across her face, ready to watch me crumble. My parents stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up with identical expressions of harsh, unforgiving judgment. Liam lowered the crowbar just an inch, leaning his weight forward into the doorway. He looked me up and down, clearly thrown off by my immaculate business attire and my complete lack of tears. But his massive ego quickly recovered. "Time to go, Kendra Liam," said his voice a low, nasty sneer. "The game is over. You are done." I looked directly into his pale, greedy eyes. I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. My face remained a mask of absolute chilling indifference. "You are right about one thing, Liam," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any fear. "Someone is definitely done." Without another word, I took a single deliberate step to the side. By shifting my body out of the center of the doorway, I cleared the visual pathway directly into the grand, sweeping expanse of the foyer and the massive marble staircase rising behind me. I watched the exact second the reality of the situation registered in Liam's brain. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. The smug, victorious sneer on his face evaporated as if it had been burned away. His jaw went slack. The flesh of arrogant adrenaline completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror, fixating on the figures standing silently in the shadows of the staircase behind me. His fingers went completely limp. The heavy steel crowbar slipped from his grasp. It hit the stone porch with a loud, violent clatter, bouncing off the steps and coming to a rest at my father's feet. Liam did not even flinch at the sound. He was completely paralyzed. His breathing stopped, his entire world collapsing in a fraction of a second as he stared into the grand foyer. The heavy steel crowbar clattered against the stone porch, but Liam did not even flinch at the loud noise. He was completely paralyzed. His pale eyes were blown wide, fixed entirely on the shadows of the grand staircase right behind my shoulder. Just seconds ago, he was a man high on the thrill of his own perceived dominance. He thought he was the apex predator coming to put a disobedient black woman in her place. Now I watched every single drop of that unearned confidence violently drained. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He tried to take a step backward, but his legs refused to cooperate. He was trapped in the sudden crushing gravity of a reality he never saw coming. I did not even need to turn my head to know who he was looking at. I already knew exactly who was standing in my foyer. To my immediate left was Reginald, my grandfather's attorney. He was dressed in a flawless navy suit, holding his leather briefcase with both hands, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. But Reginald was not the reason Liam was currently suffocating on his own fear. Flanking my attorney were 4 other individuals who had quietly arrived through the secured service entrance of the estate nearly an hour before my family ever breached the front gates. Standing directly behind me was the district attorney of Fulton County. He wore a crisp, dark suit and a stern, unforgiving expression. And framing the district attorney were 3 federal agents. They were broad-shouldered, imposing men wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their chests. The sheer suffocating weight of federal law enforcement had completely filled my grandfather's home. The air on the front porch went completely dead. The arrogant sneer on my family's faces melted away into a shared, agonizing terror. I looked directly into Liam's wide, panicked eyes. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands relaxed at my sides. "You are right, Liam," I said, my voice smooth and lethal, echoing off the high marble walls of the foyer and spilling out into the cold morning air. "Someone is definitely done." Liam opened his mouth to speak. He tried to stammer out a defense, perhaps to brandish the fake injunction still clutched in his trembling left hand, but no words came out. He was completely stripped of his voice. The illusion of his tech genius persona and his master manipulator status was entirely shattered by the presence of the federal agents staring him down. The ripple effect of the horror moved rapidly through the rest of my family. Chloe, who had been leaning around Liam just moments ago with a vicious, triumphant smirk, suddenly let out a sharp, choked gasp. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her designer handbag slipping from her shoulder and hitting the wet concrete. She instinctively took a huge step away from her husband, her eyes darting between the federal agents and Liam. I watched her realize in real time that the man she married was about to drag her down into a massive criminal conspiracy. Her lavish lifestyle was evaporating right before her eyes. Yvonne grabbed the stone railing of the porch to steady herself. My mother, the woman who cared more about country club invitations and her pristine high society image than her own daughter, physically slumped. She let out a whimpering, pathetic sound as the reality of federal prison materialized right in front of her face. She had spent my entire life telling me I was an embarrassment. Yet here she was standing on my front porch about to become the biggest scandal Atlanta had ever seen. Tyrone physically stumbled backward. My father tripped over his own expensive shoes, his arms flailing slightly as he lost his balance. The quiet, enabling patriarch was finally confronted with a problem he could not ignore or brush under the rug. He looked at the district attorney, his face a mask of absolute, undeniable guilt. For years, he had protected his fragile ego by hiding behind my mother's loud abuse and Liam's financial schemes. Now, stripped of his enablers, he just looked like a terrified, pathetic old man who had betrayed his own parents. Even the corrupt local deputy Liam had brought along realized the game was over. The moment he spotted the federal windbreakers in my foyer, his arrogant swagger vanished completely. I watched him quietly reach down and snap the retention strap over his holstered weapon, making sure his hands were completely visible. He slowly took a step backward, trying to blend in with the hired security guards, hoping to quietly back his way down the driveway and disappear before the agents noticed him. The private security team Liam had hired also began to slowly retreat, realizing they had been brought to a federal crime scene under false pretenses. They wanted absolutely no part of what was about to happen, but the corrupt deputy was far too late. The low rumbling sound of heavy vehicle engines echoed from the back of the estate. The deputy whipped his head around, looking past my parents' vehicles. Two unmarked black federal vehicles had just pulled up and blocked the rear service gates, while a local police cruiser pulled in right behind their convoy in the main driveway. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the morning fog. The trap was completely sealed. No one was leaving this property. The district attorney stepped forward, moving past me and crossing the threshold onto the front porch. The morning sunlight caught the gold seal on his identification badge. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at Chloe. He walked directly up to Liam, invading his personal space with the full, intimidating weight of the law. Liam shrank back, finally dropping the useless, fabricated injunction papers onto the porch. The pages scattered across the stone steps, completely ignored and fluttering in the morning breeze. The confidence that allowed him to yell through a megaphone just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. The district attorney reached into his interior jacket pocket. He did not pull out a temporary injunction for property management. He did not pull out a civil complaint. He pulled out a thick, legally binding document, stamped with the official seal of a federal judge. Liam, the district attorney, said, his voice deep and entirely devoid of sympathy. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest." The words hung in the cold morning air, heavier than the rain from the night before. Liam stood completely frozen on my front porch, his eyes darting frantically between the district attorney and the 3 federal agents standing in my grand foyer. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic, breathless sound came out. The man who had spent the last 3 years parading around Atlanta as a visionary tech founder, the man who had just threatened to break down my door and take my home by force, was now trembling so violently that his knees visibly shook beneath his tailored suit. I stepped past the federal agents and moved right to the threshold of the doorway. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I operated with the precise, methodical composure of a woman who had already won the war. I reached into the sleek leather briefcase I had placed on the console table and pulled out the heavy black leather-bound ledger I had recovered from my grandfather's floor safe. I held it out. The lead agent stepped forward and took it from my hands. I introduced myself officially to the agents, confirming my identity as the sole executive of the estate and a licensed senior financial auditor. I told them that inside that ledger, they would find a meticulously documented forensic trail curated by my late grandfather. I explained that it contained months of unauthorized banking activity, forged internal authorization forms, and clear evidence of systematic embezzlement from our family commercial real estate accounts. I watched Liam's face turn a sickening shade of gray as I listed his crimes out loud. But I was not finished. I turned to the district attorney, who was watching me with a look of quiet respect. I also want to formally notify your office of a digital submission, I said, clearly ensuring that my mother and father, standing at the bottom of the porch steps, heard every single word. The exterior intercom system on this estate is hardwired to a secure cloud-based server. Approximately 10 minutes ago, Liam made a detailed, unsolicited confession through that intercom. He publicly admitted to controlling the commercial accounts moving stolen capital for 8 months and managing the offshore limited liability companies mentioned in that ledger. I have already packaged the high-definition audio files and emailed them directly to your fraud division. You have his full confession on tape. Liam let out a strangled, desperate noise. He lunged backwards, stumbling over the crowbar he had dropped just moments earlier. He snorts, held his hands up in a gesture of surrender, shaking his head wildly. No, Liam stammered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch. No, you do not understand. I was authorized. Tyrone gave me the authorization. My father-in-law told me to move those funds. This is a family dispute. This is just a misunderstanding over the estate distribution. The district attorney did not even blink at the pathetic attempt to shift the blame. He stepped firmly onto the porch, invading Liam's space completely. The 2 federal agents moved in flawlessly behind him, flanking my brother-in-law and cutting off any avenue of escape. Liam, the district attorney, said, his voice ringing with absolute, uncompromising authority. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sharp, metallic sound of the handcuffs ratcheting closed around Liam's wrists echoed like a final verdict across the pristine property. The agents patted him down, completely stripping him of his dignity in front of his hired private security team, who were currently staring at the ground, pretending they had no idea who he was. The district attorney continued reading him his rights formally, citing multiple counts of wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and forgery across state lines. That was when the reality of the situation finally broke through Chloe's shock. My younger sister had been standing off to the side, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she watched her husband being treated like a common criminal. But Chloe had always possessed a profound, almost terrifying instinct for self-preservation. The moment she heard the words federal prison and wire fraud, her entire demeanor shifted. The loyal, entitled wife persona instantly evaporated, replaced by a frantic, desperate victim. Chloe lunged forward, grabbing Liam by the shoulder of his suit jacket and forcefully shoving him away from her. She started screaming, her voice shrill and echoing with manufactured betrayal. How could you do this to me? Chloe shrieked, tears streaming down her face as she backed away from him. How could you steal from my family? I trusted you. I thought your tech company was finally taking off. I thought we were successful. I had absolutely no idea he was doing this. She turned her frantic, tear-stained face toward the federal agents, holding her hands up in surrender. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime playing the clueless innocent spouse who had simply been swept up in a bad man's deception. I swear to you, I did not know, Chloe cried out, looking at the district attorney with wide, pleading eyes. I am just his wife. He kept all his business dealings a secret from me. I thought he was bringing in legitimate investor capital. You cannot blame me for his crimes. He lied to me just like he lied to my parents. Liam twisted against the grip of the federal agents, looking at his wife in pure, unadulterated shock. The woman he had stolen millions to please was throwing him to the wolves without a second of hesitation. But I knew Chloe better than anyone on this earth. I knew she was fundamentally incapable of living within a budget. I knew that when Liam's startup failed to generate a single dollar of revenue, Chloe had refused to downgrade her lifestyle. She had refused to give up her designer wardrobes, her luxury car leases, and her 5-star vacations. She was not a victim. She was the driving force behind his desperation. I reached back into my leather briefcase. My hand wrapped around a second, much thinner folder. I pulled it out and stepped out onto the porch, standing directly in the morning sunlight. I held the second folder out toward the district attorney. You might want to take a very close look at the banking authorization signatures on those offshore shell companies, I said, my voice dripping with cold, deliberate precision. Liam was certainly the architect of this embezzlement scheme, but he was not operating alone. Chloe stopped crying. The frantic waving of her hands froze midair. She slowly turned her head to look at me, the color completely draining from her cheeks. I looked my sister dead in the eye. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for her. You see, Chloe, I continued, making sure my voice carried over to where my mother and father were standing in paralyzed fear. In order to move that much capital out of the country without triggering an immediate internal audit, Liam needed a secondary verifier on the newly established accounts. He needed someone with direct legal ties to the family name to legitimize the transfers. I tapped the front of the folder. I reviewed the corporate registry documents my grandfather acquired before he died. You co-signed every single one of those fraudulent wire transfers. Chloe, you knowingly authorized the movement of stolen capital to fund your luxury shopping sprees and keep up appearances at your country club. You are not a victim. You are a co-conspirator. Chloe froze completely. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out, the theatrical tears drying instantly on her cheeks. She was trapped. She realized in that exact moment that there was no manipulation tactic, no fake crying, and no amount of whining that could save her from a federal paper trail. I handed the folder to the district attorney, sealing her fate. The trap had fully snapped shut, and they were all going down together. The heavy silence that followed my revelation was completely suffocating. Chloe stood paralyzed on the stone steps. Her eyes were locked on the thin manila folder I had just handed to the district attorney. The federal agents did not hesitate. They moved in swiftly, pulling Chloe away from the front door and reciting her rights just as they had done to her husband. The reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining pieces of my family's arrogant facade. My mother could no longer pretend this was a simple misunderstanding. Ivan let out a desperate guttural cry that echoed across the vast courtyard. She abandoned all her carefully practiced elegance. She scrambled up the stone steps of the porch, her expensive heels slipping on the damp concrete. She rushed directly toward me, pushing past the federal agents. She reached out and grabbed my arm. Her manicured nails dug painfully into the fabric of my tailored blazer. "Kendra, please," Ivan begged. Her voice was shrill and completely stripped of its usual commanding authority. Her eyes were wide with a frantic animalistic panic. "You have to stop this right now. Tell them it is a mistake. Tell them we can handle the accounting internally. We are your parents, Kendra. We gave you life. We are your family. You cannot send your own sister and your own family to federal prison." I did not pull my arm away immediately. I stood perfectly still, letting her hold on to me, letting her feel the absolute rigidity of my posture. I looked down at her trembling hand, gripping my sleeve. Then I slowly raised my gaze to meet her terrified, pleading eyes. I saw no genuine love in her expression. I only saw a woman who was absolutely terrified of losing her country club memberships, her social status, and her freedom. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my jacket. I smoothed the wrinkled fabric where she had grabbed me. "You threw me out into the freezing rain last night," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried a cold, unyielding weight that made her physically shrink back. "You threw my belongings onto the wet asphalt. You looked me in the eye and told me I was dead to you. You told me I was no longer a part of this family because I refused to let you steal from the legacy my grandfather built. So do not stand here and beg me for mercy in the name of family. Consider this my ghost haunting you." Ivan let out a choked, devastated sob. She covered her face with her hands, finally realizing that the daughter she had treated like a disposable asset for 35 years was now the architect of her complete destruction. She turned around, looking desperately for her husband to intervene, to do what he always did and enforce their authority. But my father was not interested in saving my mother or my sister. Tyrone had finally realized that the federal agents were not just here for Liam and Chloe. They were here to dismantle the entire financial conspiracy, and his name was written all over the forged authorization forms. Tyrone stepped forward, but he did not look at me. He looked directly at the lead federal agent. The quiet, stoic patriarch who had always enabled my mother's abuse completely crumbled under the pressure of federal law enforcement. "Listen to me," Tyrone stammered, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I had nothing to do with the offshore accounts. Liam orchestrated the entire thing. He is the one who managed the technology startup. He is the one who set up the shell companies. He manipulated me. He told me he needed temporary bridge capital and that Harrison had quietly approved it. I was just trying to help my son-in-law." Liam lied to all of us. Liam, who was currently being escorted toward the black sport utility vehicles by 2 federal agents, heard every single word. The betrayal instantly ignited, a blazing, unhinged fury in his eyes. He stopped walking, digging his heels into the gravel driveway, and turned back to face my father. "You lying coward," Liam screamed. His voice was ragged and desperate as he thrashed against the firm grip of the agents. "Do not you dare try to put this all on me. You forged Harrison's signature on the internal transfer documents because you were too terrified to ask him for the money yourself. You knew exactly where those funds were going." Tyrone shook his head wildly, his face dripping with nervous sweat. "I did not know the extent of it. I was tricked." "You were not tricked." Liam shouted, a vicious, ugly laugh escaping his lips. "You were greedy. You wanted to maintain your pristine image as the successful heir to the empire. And when the bank auditors started asking questions about the missing liquidity 3 months ago, what did you do, Tyrone? Tell your wife what you did to cover your tracks." My mother lowered her hands from her face. She turned to look at my father, her tear-stained face suddenly registering a new, deeply unsettling confusion. Tyrone swallowed hard. He refused to make eye contact with his wife. He stared at the ground, his silence, speaking volumes. "Tell her," Liam demanded, thoroughly enjoying the carnage he was creating on his way down. "Since you want to act like the innocent victim, tell Yvonne how you hid the embezzlement from the commercial auditors." When Tyrone refused to speak, Liam looked directly at my mother with a malicious, triumphant sneer. "I used your house, Yvonne," Liam yelled across the courtyard. "Tyrone secretly signed over the deed to your massive suburban estate. He used your pristine, perfectly decorated home as collateral to secure a high-interest private bridge loan just to temporarily replace the missing capital before the quarterly audit. He mortgaged your entire life to hide his own forgery. And because my startup did not generate the revenue to pay the loan back, that note went into default last week." Yvonne looked as though all the air had been violently sucked from her lungs. Her eyes darted from Liam back to my father. "Tyrone," Yvonne whispered, her voice trembling with absolute horror. "Tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not mortgage our home." My father simply closed his eyes and hung his head. He could not deny it. The financial records I had securely stored in the cloud would prove every single word of Liam's accusation. Tyrone had literally gambled away the roof over their heads just to preserve his fragile ego and protect his fraudulent son-in-law. "You fool!" Yvonne shrieked. The realization of her impending poverty completely shattered her mind. She lunged at my father, hitting his chest with her fists. "You arrogant, stupid fool. We have nothing left. You lost our home." The federal agents did not wait for the family dispute to resolve. They firmly guided Liam down the rest of the driveway, forcing him into the back of the unmarked vehicle. Chloe was escorted right behind him. My younger sister was sobbing uncontrollably. The mascara she had carefully applied that morning was running down her face in thick, dark streaks. She looked back at me one last time before an agent guided her into the back seat. There was no defiance left in her eyes. There was only the crushing, terrifying realization that her life of luxury and unearned privilege was permanently over. She was going to be booked, fingerprinted, and processed through the federal justice system. The doors of the black vehicles slammed shut in unison. The sound signaled the absolute end of their reign. I stood on the porch of my $22 million estate and watched the convoy of law enforcement vehicles slowly turn around in the expansive courtyard. They drove back down the long, winding driveway, passing through the broken iron gates and disappearing onto the main road. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance. The overwhelming noise and chaos of the morning suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, heavy silence. I looked down at the bottom of the porch steps. Yvonne and Tyrone were the only ones left. They were standing alone in the damp gravel. My mother was weeping softly into her hands, completely stripped of her arrogance and her social standing. My father stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the driveway, where his golden child and his reputation had just been hauled away in handcuffs. They had come to this property fully expecting to intimidate me into handing over my entire inheritance. They expected to break my spirit and cast me out with nothing. Instead, they were standing in the cold morning air, slowly realizing the absolute magnitude of their failure. They had not just lost their eldest daughter. They had lost their golden child, their freedom, their home, and absolutely everything they had ever valued. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal convoy completely vanished down the winding tree-lined road, leaving nothing behind but the damp morning mist. The overwhelming chaos that had consumed my front driveway just minutes ago evaporated into a profound, suffocating silence. I stood on the top step of the grand porch, the cold air biting through my tailored blazer, and looked down at the only two people left standing in the gravel. My mother, Yvonne, was weeping. Her meticulously styled hair was ruined by the dampness, and her designer coat hung loosely on her shaking frame. She looked incredibly small. All her life, she had derived her power from her volume, her cruelty, and her ability to make me feel entirely worthless. Now, stripped of her golden child and her stolen wealth, she was just a terrified, broken woman shivering in the driveway. My father, Tyrone, stood beside her, but he offered no comfort. I was completely paralyzed, his eyes locked on the empty road, where his reputation had just been hauled away in handcuffs. The quiet, enabling patriarch had finally met a consequence his silence could not fix. Neither of them looked up at me. They were too consumed by the realization of their own destruction. I did not offer them a jacket. I did not ask my security team to call them a cab. They had thrown me out into a freezing rainstorm less than 24 hours ago and told me I was dead to them. I was simply honoring their request. I turned my back on my parents, stepped over the heavy steel crowbar Liam had dropped on the stone porch, and walked back inside my $22 million estate. I grabbed the solid brass handles of the massive mahogany double doors and pulled them shut. The heavy, definitive click of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the grand foyer. I locked them outside in the cold, severing my ties to their toxicity forever. The fallout over the next few weeks was absolutely catastrophic, a masterclass in financial and social ruin. As a senior financial auditor, I had seen companies collapse overnight. But watching the swift, methodical dismantling of my family's facade was entirely different. The federal investigation ripped through their lives like a hurricane. Because my grandfather had meticulously documented everything in his ledger, the federal prosecutors had an airtight case. They froze every single bank account tied to Liam, Chloe, and my parents. But the most devastating blow came from the bank. During the confrontation, Liam had maliciously exposed Tyrone's deepest secret. My father had secretly signed over the deed to their massive suburban estate, using the pristine, perfectly decorated home as collateral to secure a high-interest private bridge loan. He had done it to temporarily replace the missing capital before the commercial auditors could discover the embezzlement. But Liam's tech startup was a black hole. It generated zero revenue, and the loan had gone into default. Banks do not care about your social standing or your church congregation. When the news of the federal fraud investigation broke, the private lender moved with ruthless efficiency. The foreclosure process in Georgia is fast, and my parents had absolutely no liquid capital left to save themselves. Within 3 weeks, the bank seized the property. Yvonne and Tyrone were formally evicted from the suburban fortress, where they had spent 35 years making me feel like an unwelcome guest. They were forced to pack whatever personal belongings the feds had not seized and vacate the premises. The financial ruin was absolute, but for my parents, the social ruin was a fate worse than death. Atlanta has a tight-knit, deeply connected community of affluent Black professionals. Reputation is the ultimate currency. You can survive a bad business deal, but you cannot survive stealing millions from a revered elder, especially a self-made titan like my grandfather, who had spent his life pouring resources back into his community. The scandal hit the local evening news and spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. The headlines were brutal, detailing how a prominent pastor and his socialite wife had conspired with their white son-in-law to defraud their own family. The whisper networks tore my mother's reputation to shreds. The consequences were immediate and humiliating. Yvonne's prestigious country club membership was revoked by the board of directors, citing a violation of their moral conduct clause. My father was forced to resign from his position at the church, asked to step down by a congregation that felt deeply betrayed by his hypocrisy. The people who used to attend their lavish holiday parties, the friends who drank their expensive wine and praised their perfect family, completely vanished. They cut all ties, refusing to return my mother's desperate phone calls. They abandoned Yvonne and Tyrone just as swiftly and callously as my parents had abandoned me at my lowest point. They became social pariah, completely isolated in a city they once thought they ruled. I monitored the fallout from the quiet sanctuary of my grandfather's study, managing the estate and coordinating with the federal prosecutors. I felt no guilt. I felt no pity. The universe was simply balancing the scales, handing them the exact energy they had put out into the world. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about a month after the incident on the porch. I was sitting at my grandfather's heavy oak desk, reviewing a portfolio of new investment strategies for the capital I had secured. The warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a peaceful glow over the room. The estate was quiet, protected, and entirely mine. My personal cell phone buzzed on the desk. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification showed an unknown local number. I let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another reporter trying to get an exclusive interview about the family scandal. A few minutes later, the voicemail transcription notification popped up on my screen. I pressed play, putting the phone on speaker as I continued reviewing my financial documents. "Kendra, please, it is your mother." Ivan's voice filled the quiet study. It was completely unrecognizable. The sharp, arrogant, commanding tone she had used my entire life was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a pathetic, reedy, trembling whisper. She sounded exhausted and utterly broken. "We have nowhere else to go," Yvonne pleaded, her voice cracking as she sobbed into the receiver. "The bank took the house. Your father cannot find work. None of our friends will speak to us. We are staying in a cheap motel off the highway, and the money is almost gone. Kendra, I know you are angry, but I am begging you. You have that massive estate. You have all those empty guest houses on the property. Please just let us stay in one of the guest houses until we can get back on our feet. We will stay out of your way. I promise. We are your family. Please, baby. I am so sorry." I sat back in my leather chair and listened to the sound of her weeping. A year ago, hearing my mother cry would have sent me into a panic. I would have dropped everything to fix her problems, desperate to earn her approval and prove my worth. I would have opened my doors, emptied my wallet, and let her continue to destroy my peace just to feel like I belonged. But that version of Kendra died the night she threw my suitcase into the rain. I looked around the beautiful, secure study my grandfather had left to me. I thought about his lady, about the hard work and integrity he used to build this empire. He had trusted me to protect it from parasites, and I was going to honor that trust. I reached out and picked up my phone. I did not listen to the rest of her tearful apology. I did not wait for her to finish her desperate bargaining. I simply pressed the delete button. The recording vanished, cutting her sobbing off mid-sentence, erasing her voice from my life completely. I set the phone face down on the desk, picked up my pen, and went right back to work. I had an empire to run, and I had absolutely no space left for ghosts. I did not just delete my mother's pathetic voicemail. I deleted my entire past. Within an hour of setting my phone down on my grandfather's desk, I contacted my telecommunications provider and instructed them to completely wipe my personal and business numbers. I had new lines issued under a corporate privacy screen that made them impossible to trace back to me. I then called Reginald, my attorney, and instructed him to file the most airtight, uncompromising restraining orders the state of Georgia had ever seen against Ivan, Tyrone, and Chloe. I refused to leave any loophole open for their manipulation. Later that afternoon, I called the lead commander of my private estate security team into the study. I handed him printed high-resolution photographs of my parents and my sister. I made it explicitly clear that if any of those three individuals came within 500 feet of the Buckhead property or any of my commercial buildings in downtown Atlanta, they were to be treated as hostile trespassers. There would be no gentle warnings and no polite escorts off the premises. The police were to be called immediately and charges pressed to the fullest extent of the law. I built a fortress around my peace and locked the gates permanently. I had spent 35 years trying to fit into a family that only valued me when they could exploit me. Now they were locked outside the empire they desperately tried to steal. With the perimeter secured and the toxicity blocked from my life, I turned my full attention to the $22 million fortune sitting in front of me. I was not a woman who simply sat on wealth. I was a senior financial auditor, and I treated my own estate like a hostile corporate acquisition. I spent the next 2 months living and breathing balance sheets, property deeds, and stock portfolios. I combed through every single account my grandfather had acquired over his lifetime, identifying exactly where my father and Liam had attempted to bleed the accounts dry. I ruthlessly cut the dead weight. I liquidated the underperforming commercial assets that my father had mismanaged during his brief unauthorized stint playing businessman. I fired the prestigious wealth management firm that had turned a blind eye while Liam moved capital into offshore shell companies. I did not just fire them. I reported their gross negligence to the financial regulatory authorities. I then transferred the entire portfolio to a boutique financial institution that specialized in aggressive, high-yield growth and absolute discretion. I optimized the tax structures, restructured the corporate holding entities, and consolidated the liquid assets into secure high-interest trusts. I transformed a massive bleeding estate into a fortified revenue-generating fortress. It was exhausting, meticulous work. There were nights I fell asleep at the heavy oak desk surrounded by spreadsheets and highlighters, but every ledger I balanced and every account I secured felt like I was honoring the black man who built this legacy from the ground up. While I was restructuring the empire, the federal justice system was busy dismantling my white brother-in-law. The trial was swift and utterly merciless. Liam tried to use his privilege and his silver tongue to charm the federal judge. He attempted to paint himself as an overly ambitious tech entrepreneur who simply made a few administrative errors while trying to launch a groundbreaking application. The judge was not amused in the slightest. The crystal-clear audio recording of Liam's arrogant confession on my front porch, combined with the irrefutable paper trail of forged signatures in my grandfather's ledger, destroyed any chance he had at a defense. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Liam was convicted of multiple counts of wire fraud, grand embezzlement, and forgery across state lines. The judge sentenced him to a decade in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. I did not attend the sentencing hearing. I did not need to see him in handcuffs again. I simply read the transcript. Reginald emailed me, took a sip of my morning coffee, and archived the message. Liam was officially a ghost. Chloe fared slightly better in the legal system, but her punishment carried a poetic justice that no prison sentence could ever match. Realizing she was completely cornered by the Keo-signed offshore wire transfers, I handed over to the district attorney. My sister abandoned her entire defense. She threw Liam under the bus and took a plea deal to avoid doing hard time behind bars. The judge showed her a sliver of mercy due to her lack of prior criminal history, but he made sure she did not walk away unscathed. She was slapped with heavy federal probation, massive financial restitution that bankrupted her, and 1,000 hours of court-ordered community service. But the true masterpiece of her sentencing was the location of that community service. The former luxury socialite, the woman who used to mock my off-the-rack business suits and flaunt her designer cashmere coats, was ordered to work her 1,000 hours sorting donated clothes at a busy downtown thrift store. I heard through the Atlanta Whisper Network that she had to take the public city bus to get there because her luxury vehicles had been immediately repossessed by the bank. She spent her days folding stained denim, tagging clearance items, and dealing with angry customers under harsh fluorescent lighting. She was completely stripped of the unearned wealth she had built her entire personality around. The universe truly has a brilliant sense of humor when you step back and let it do its job. With my family surgically removed from my life and the criminals held accountable, the air inside the Buckhead mansion finally felt light. The brutal legal battles were over. The assets were growing securely in the bank. My parents were a distant, fading memory, living in a cheap motel off the highway. I finally had the mental and emotional space to breathe. It was late on a quiet Friday evening. The rain was gently tapping against the large windows of the study, a soothing sound that completely erased the memory of the storm I had been thrown into months ago. I was sitting at my grandfather's desk, organizing the very last of his physical paperwork into archival storage boxes. I wanted the office to be a clean slate for my own business ventures. I opened the bottom right drawer of the desk to clear out a stack of old yellowed stationery. As I pulled the heavy paper out, my fingers brushed against something wedged tightly into the back panel of the wooden drawer. I paused, reaching my hand further into the dark space. It was a thick, sealed manila envelope that had been carefully taped out of sight, hidden from anyone who might casually glance inside. I peeled the old tape back and pulled the envelope out into the warm light of the brass desk lamp. Written across the front of the envelope in my grandfather's bold and unmistakable handwriting were the words for Kendra, the true builder. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed a silver letter opener and carefully sliced through the sealed flap. I pulled out a thick stack of typed documents and spread them across the leather bladder. It was not a will. It was not a financial ledger or a list of bank accounts. It was a fully drafted, meticulously detailed business plan. I leaned forward and started reading the executive summary on the first page, and my heart immediately began to race against my ribs. My grandfather had not just left me his money to hoard in a bank vault. He had left me a massive, fully funded blueprint for a revolution. They were a comprehensive, meticulously researched business blueprint. My grandfather had mapped out a philanthropic enterprise designed to inject real sustainable capital back into our community. He had the vision, the financial models, and the exact corporate structure already outlined in his neat, deliberate handwriting. He simply ran out of time before he could execute it. As I sat in his heavy oak chair, tracing the lines of ink on the aged paper, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. I did not just inherit his money. I had inherited his ultimate mandate. The very next morning, I contacted the new boutique wealth management team I had recently hired to protect my assets. I instructed them to carve out exactly $10 million from the restructured liquid portfolios. We were not going to set up a passive, feel-good charity that hosted expensive dinners and accomplished absolutely nothing. We were going to build an aggressive, highly targeted venture capital incubator. By the end of the week, I officially filed the incorporation paperwork for the Vivian and Harrison Foundation. The mission of the foundation was fiercely specific and deeply personal. We provided debt-free venture capital grants, rigorous executive mentorship, and comprehensive financial literacy programs exclusively for young, independent African-American women starting their own businesses. I had spent my entire life watching my parents bow down to a mediocre white man, allowing him to drain their generational wealth simply because they lacked the backbone and the financial literacy to challenge him. They cared more about proximity to whiteness and protecting their fragile social status than they cared about their own legacy. I refused to let that cycle continue in the next generation. I wanted to ensure that brilliant, driven Black women had the ironclad financial independence they needed to never rely on toxic family dynamics or manipulative partners. I wanted them to know how to read the fine print on a term sheet, how to ruthlessly audit a balance sheet, and how to spot a financial predator from a mile away. True power is not just having money sitting in a bank account. True power is understanding exactly how money moves, how it grows, and knowing how to protect it from parasites who feel entirely entitled to your labor. 6 months of relentless, grueling work followed the initial filing. I hired a board of directors comprised of the sharpest legal and financial minds in Atlanta. We vetted hundreds of applications and selected our first cohort of 20 female founders. These were women building real viable companies, a green tech logistics firm, a healthcare data platform, a commercial real estate development group. They were the exact opposite of Liam and his fake vaporware startup. To celebrate the official launch of the foundation, I decided to host a massive gala. But I did not rent a generic hotel ballroom or a trendy downtown event space. I hosted it right at the Buckhead estate. I wanted to fundamentally reclaim the energy of my grandparents' home. The massive property, which had almost been the site of my ultimate humiliation and physical eviction, was completely transformed. The winding gravel driveway where Liam, Chloe, and my parents had parked their aggressive convoy of sport utility vehicles was now lined with luxury sedans and professional valet attendants. The grand mahogany double doors, the same doors Liam had threatened to break down with a steel crowbar, were thrown wide open to welcome genuine, inspiring guests into the warmth of the foyer. The mansion was filled with vibrant, undeniable life. Instead of the pretentious, fake, social climbing friends, my mother used to desperately entertain at her country club dinners. The rooms buzzed with authentic energy. Brilliant entrepreneurs, local civic leaders, and real friends who had supported me long before I inherited $22 million filled the expansive halls. A live jazz band played softly on the back marble terrace, and the rich scent of elevated southern catering mingled with the fresh floral arrangements decorating the entryway. I did not wear a stiff, conservative business suit that night. I wore a stunning, custom-tailored emerald green gown that swept gracefully across the imported stone floors. I felt radiant, powerful, and completely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. As the evening reached its peak and the champagne glasses were filled, I stepped up to the acrylic podium that had been set up right in the center of the grand foyer. I was standing on the exact spot where I had opened the door to reveal the federal agents months prior. The crowd quieted immediately as I tapped the microphone. I looked out at the sea of beautiful, ambitious women who were about to permanently change the landscape of Atlanta business. I spoke about my grandparents. I talked about how Vivian and Harrison built their legacy through relentless grit, sharp intellect, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. I spoke about the dangerous trap of entitlement and the absolute necessity of maintaining ruthless financial boundaries to protect your peace. I looked directly at the 20 women in our inaugural cohort and told them that they, not the people who shared my blood, were the true living legacy of this estate. The applause that followed was absolutely deafening. It bounced off the high ceilings and echoed down the long corridors of the mansion. It was not the polite manufactured clapping of a corporate networking event. It was the loud, joyful ringing sound of a community recognizing a genuine, tangible shift in power. I smiled, feeling a profound, deep-seated peace settle into my bones. The toxic memory of my parents screaming on the front porch was permanently erased, replaced by the triumph of this moment. I stepped down from the podium, accepting warm hugs, handshakes, and expressions of gratitude as I made my way through the dense crowd. As I navigated toward the back terrace to get a breath of fresh air, my eyes caught a familiar figure standing near the edge of the room. I was holding a glass of sparkling water, watching the celebration unfold with a quiet, knowing smile on his face. It was Reginald. My grandfather's attorney looked remarkably relaxed, a stark contrast to the tense, grim man who had sat at the head of the conference table and read the will all those months ago. I made my way over to him, returning his warm smile. He congratulated me on the spectacular launch of the foundation, telling me that this incubator was exactly what Harrison had envisioned when he first started drafting those early business plans in his study. Then Reginald's expression shifted. The polite conversational smile faded into something much more serious and solemn. He placed his glass of sparkling water on a passing waiter's silver tray and asked if we could step into the hallway for a private moment. We walked away from the lively music and the joyful laughter, stepping into the quiet, dimly lit corridor just outside my grandfather's private study. Reginald reached into the interior breast pocket of his tailored navy suit jacket. He pulled out a thick sealed envelope made of heavy cream-colored parchment paper. He held it out to me, his hand perfectly steady. His voice was hushed and deeply reverent as he explained that my grandfather had given him this exact envelope several months before the fatal car crash. Harrison had left Reginald with one very specific, unbreakable legal instruction regarding the document. The attorney was strictly ordered to hold on to the letter in a secure vault and hand it to me only after the estate was fully secured. The foundation was officially launched, and the dust from the inevitable ugly family war had completely settled. I stared down at the heavy cream-colored parchment resting in my hands. Reginald gave me a slow, respectful nod before quietly turning around and walking back toward the music and the joyful laughter of the gala. He left me completely alone in the shadowed corridor. The contrast between the vibrant celebration happening in the grand foyer and the absolute stillness of this hallway was profound. I ran my thumb over the thick wax seal on the back of the envelope. The crimson wax bore the official crest of my grandfather's original investment firm. My heart beat a heavy, steady rhythm against my ribs as I turned away from the noise and walked slowly down the hall. I pushed open the heavy oak door to his private study. The room was dark, except for the moonlight spilling through the large paneled windows, casting long, elegant shadows across the Persian rug. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I simply walked over to the massive mahogany desk, switched on the small brass reading lamp, and sat down in his leather executive chair. I broke the wax seal. Inside was a single piece of thick stationery covered in his bold, unmistakable handwriting. The black ink was slightly faded, a testament to how long he had kept this secret, waiting for the exact right moment to deliver his final message. My dearest Kendra, the letter began. If Reginald has handed you this envelope, it means you have successfully weathered the storm I always knew was coming. It means you survived the fallout. And more importantly, it means you did exactly what I always knew you would do. You protected our legacy. I read the words carefully, my eyes scanning the page as my grandfather laid out the painful truth he had carried in absolute silence for years. He wrote extensively about my parents. He explained that he knew our family was rotting from the inside out long before the capital started mysteriously disappearing from his commercial accounts. He saw how my mother, Yvonne, valued superficial status over genuine substance, trading authentic connection for the shallow approval of her affluent country club peers. He detailed a specific Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago where he watched Yvonne completely ignore my recent promotion to senior financial auditor so she could lavish praise on Chloe for buying a new designer handbag. I saw how my father, Tyrone, lacked the fundamental backbone to lead a family, preferring to hide behind his wife's loud cruelty rather than stand up for what was right. He knew Chloe was spoiled beyond repair, raised to believe that her mere existence entitled her to the world without ever having to work for a single thing. And he knew exactly what Liam was from the very first day Chloe brought him to the estate. My grandfather called Liam a parasite, a mediocre, arrogant man who saw our hard-earned black wealth as his personal playground, completely devoid of the talent or the grit required to build anything of his own. I explained why he never confronted them directly while he was alive. He wrote that confronting them would have only resulted in endless denial and exhausting manipulation. They would have hidden their tracks, played the victims, and found another way to bleed the estate dry the moment he turned his back. He needed a permanent, definitive solution. He needed someone who would not flinch when the time came to sever the infected branches from the family tree. The next paragraph was written with a heavy, deliberate pressure, as if he wanted the words to permanently brand themselves into my mind. "I left it all to you, Kendra," he wrote. "Not because you needed the money, but because you were the only one strong enough to hold the sword and cut the rod away. You have always been our true legacy. You inherited my analytical mind and your grandmother's fierce, unbreakable spirit. I knew they would attack you. I knew they would try to break you down and take what was yours by force. But I also knew you would never let them win. I knew you would build something magnificent from the ashes of their greed." I stopped reading. The air in the study suddenly felt incredibly thin. I read that specific sentence over and over again. "You have always been our true legacy." For 35 years, I had been the designated family scapegoat. I had been the daughter who was never pretty enough, the sister who was constantly belittled, the woman who was thrown out into the freezing Atlanta rain and told she was dead to her own blood. I had spent decades quietly absorbing their insults, burying my pain under 80, our work weeks and impressive professional achievements, just praying for a fraction of the validation they freely handed to my sister. I had conditioned myself to be an unfailing machine, processing human emotions like sterile data points, locking away my grief so I could fight the brutal war they started on my front porch. But sitting in that leather chair, holding the handwritten proof that the two people I respected most in this world truly saw me, valued me, and trusted me with everything they had built, caused the heavy steel armor I had worn my entire life to completely shatter. For the first time since the devastating phone call announcing their fatal car crash, I finally allowed myself to cry. The tears did not come as a polite, silent weeping. They came as a profound physical release. My chest heaved and a loud, ragged sob tore through my throat, echoing in the quiet study. I cried for the grandparents I missed so desperately. I cried for the little girl who just wanted her mother to love her without demanding perfection. But as the tears streamed down my face, ruining my flawless makeup and dropping onto the polished wood of the desk, the agonizing weight of my past completely dissolved. These were not tears of fresh grief or bitter anger. They were tears of profound, absolute vindication. They were tears of pure, unadulterated peace. The war was officially over. The rot was permanently cut away. I had walked through the fire they set for me and emerged completely unsinged. I sat there until the tears naturally stopped. I took a deep cleansing breath and wiped my face with the back of my hand. I carefully folded the heavy parchment paper, making sure the creases were perfectly aligned. I slipped the letter into the hidden pocket of my emerald gown, keeping his final words pressed close to my heart. I stood up from the heavy oak desk and walked over to the tall antique mirror hanging near the door. I smoothed the rich fabric of my dress, adjusted my posture, and looked directly at the woman staring back at me. She was not a victim. She was not an outcast. She was the matriarch of her own empire. I turned off the brass reading lamp, stepped out of the study, and walked back down the corridor. As I approached the grand foyer, the sound of lively jazz music and joyful conversation washed over me. I stepped back into the brilliant light of the gala, looking out at the incredible women I was currently funding. I watched them network and share ideas, building the exact future my grandfather had envisioned. I smiled, taking my rightful place at the center of the room, surrounded by a chosen family that celebrated my strength instead of trying to destroy it. I was no longer fighting for a seat at the table because I owned the entire building. 6 months had passed since the launch of the Vivian and Harrison Foundation. The chaotic noise of my past had finally settled into a quiet, predictable peace. I was sitting in the back of my chauffeur car on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, navigating through the busy downtown Atlanta traffic. I was reviewing the final financial projections for 3 incredibly brilliant tech startups. All 3 companies were founded and led by young, independent African-American women. One was revolutionizing maternal healthcare logistics to protect our communities. Another was building an encrypted financial literacy platform for marginalized youth. The third was completely disrupting the commercial real estate market to create affordable housing solutions. I was about to walk into a board meeting and officially approve their seed funding. I was about to hand them the exact tools they needed to build their own empires without ever having to compromise their dignity or rely on manipulative investors. My driver pulled up to a long red light at a busy intersection just on the edge of the city. I looked up from my tablet to rest my eyes for a moment. The neighborhood outside my tinted window was a stark contrast to the sprawling manicured estates of Buckhead. It was a gritty commercial district lined with discount stores and budget supermarkets. People were hurrying along the concrete sidewalks with their heads down against the cold wind. As I gazed out the window, my eyes locked onto two figures walking out of the sliding glass doors of a cheap discount grocery store. The breath caught in my throat for just a fraction of a second. It was Ivan and Tyrone. My mother and father were right there, standing less than 20 feet away from my car. I watched them very closely, taking in the reality of their new lives. The transformation was absolutely staggering and deeply pathetic. Ivan was not wearing her signature designer coats or her perfectly polished pearls. She was bundled in a cheap, ill-fitting jacket that looked thin and worn against the chill of the afternoon. Her posture, which used to be so impossibly rigid and dripping with country club arrogance, was completely slumped. She was carrying 3 heavy plastic grocery bags that were visibly cutting into her hands. She looked profoundly exhausted and aged beyond her years. She looked like a woman who had spent the last 6 months suffocating under the crushing weight of the poverty she had always mocked other people for experiencing. Tyrone was walking a few paces ahead of her. The quiet, enabling patriarch who used to stand in his tailored suits and pass silent judgment on my entire existence, looked like a broken, defeated old man. He was not carrying a single bag. He was not opening the door for her or offering any comfort. His face was twisted into a bitter, resentful scowl. They stopped right on the edge of the sidewalk and started arguing. Even through the thick, soundproof glass of my car, I could see the viciousness in their body language. Ivan was gesturing wildly with her heavy bags, pointing at the grocery receipt in her hand. She was likely screaming at him about their vanishing budget or his inability to find a job to support them. Tyrone threw his hands up in the air, turning his back on her and shouting something defensive in return. They were trapped in a miserable, toxic loop of their own creation. Stripped of their stolen wealth and their golden child, they had nothing left but each other and the overwhelming resentment of their total failure. A year ago, seeing my parents in this condition would have triggered a massive trauma response. I would have felt a desperate, overwhelming urge to roll down the window and fix their problems. I would have felt that familiar, suffocating guilt telling me that it was my responsibility as the eldest daughter to save them from their own terrible choices. I would have paid for their groceries, put them in a luxury hotel, and begged them to finally love me. But as I sat in the plush leather seat of my car, watching them tear each other apart over a grocery receipt, I searched my heart for that familiar pain. I searched for the anger. I searched for the bitterness and the hatred. I found absolutely nothing. There was no pain. There was no anger. There was no desire to see them suffer more. I realized in that exact moment that the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is absolute profound indifference. They were not my parents anymore. They were just 2 unhappy strangers arguing on a street corner. They were ghosts from a past life that I no longer occupied. I had completely outgrown the need for their validation, and I had completely outgrown the need for their destruction. I looked down at the brilliant business proposals resting in my lap. I thought about the $22 million legacy my grandfather had trusted me to protect. I thought about the generations of African-American women who had been told to carry the burdens of their families without complaint. I thought about how often we are expected to be the mules for everyone else's ambition, while our own dreams are starved of resources. My grandfather had recognized that insidious pattern, and he had given me the sword to cut it down. He knew that true generational wealth was not just about passing down dollars, but about passing down the wisdom to protect those dollars from parasites. Ivan and Tyrone were the parasites. They had been willing to sacrifice their own flesh and blood just to maintain a shallow proximity to whiteness through Liam and his fake startup. They traded their legacy for a country club membership and a fleeting sense of superiority, and now they were paying the ultimate price. The silence in the back of my car was a stark, beautiful contrast to the constant screaming and belittling I grew up with. It was the sound of absolute freedom, the sound of a life entirely under my own control. My parents had chosen their path. They had chosen to prioritize their fragile egos over the daughter who would have moved mountains for them. They had gambled their entire existence on a lie, and the universe had simply handed them the final bill. I did not reach for the button to roll down the window. I did not ask my driver to pull over to the curb. I did not need to step out of the car and gloat. I did not need to show them my tailored suit or my expensive vehicle to prove that I had won. Gloating is for people who are still trying to prove their worth to their abusers. I already knew my worth, and I did not need them to witness it. The traffic light turned green. I simply turned my head away from the window and looked back down at my tablet. The car accelerated smoothly, pulling away from the intersection and merging into the flow of the downtown traffic. I left Ivan and Tyrone standing on the cold concrete sidewalk arguing bitterly over cheap plastic bags. I left them in the rearview mirror and I never looked back. The driver smoothly navigated the next turn, and the discount grocery store faded entirely from view. The physical distance matching the emotional distance I had finally achieved. As we pulled up to the sleek glass building where my board meeting was waiting, I felt a profound surge of gratitude. Gratitude for the harsh lessons. Gratitude for the rainstorm that forced me out of their house. And gratitude for the unshakable spirit my grandmother had passed down to me. If you are watching this and you are currently suffocating under the weight of a toxic family, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Blood does not dictate loyalty. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to exploit your labor, drain your spirit, or treat you like a disposable asset. You never have to shrink yourself to fit into a family that only sees your value when they can use it to prop up their own fragile egos. It is terrifying to walk away from the people who are supposed to protect you. It is agonizing to realize that the unconditional love you desperately crave from them is a total illusion. But you must find the courage to pack your bags and step out into the rain. You are entirely capable of building your own table. You are capable of finding a chosen family that celebrates your strength instead of punishing you for it. The journey will break you down, but it will also rebuild you into something absolutely untouchable. Do not waste your energy plotting their downfall. Do not exhaust yourself trying to convince them of your worth. The absolute sweetest revenge is not destroying them. The sweetest revenge is simply walking away, taking your power back, and watching them destroy themselves while you build a magnificent empire they can never ever touch. For 35 years, I genuinely believed that enduring my family's toxicity was the mandatory price I had to pay for their love. I quietly swallowed their insults and shrank myself to fit into their shadow, desperately hoping that my relentless hard work would eventually earn their respect. But the harsh, undeniable reality I learned on that freezing driveway in Atlanta is that blood does not ever dictate loyalty. Sharing a last name does not give anyone the right to exploit your labor, drain your spirit, or treat you as a disposable asset to prop up their own fragile egos. Family should be a sanctuary, not a battleground where your worth is constantly weaponized against you. The most profound lesson I took away from the wreckage of my parents' facade is the absolute necessity of financial and emotional independence. My grandparents did not just leave me a massive fortune. They left me a clear mandate to hold the sword and cut the rod away. I realized that true power is not about destroying those who hurt you. It is about building an unshakable, fortified foundation so their cruelty can no longer reach you. By walking away and using my resources to empower other independent African-American women, I learned that the sweetest revenge is never anger or retaliation. The sweetest revenge is absolute profound indifference. When you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you are only valued for what can be extracted from you, you finally gain the strength to build an empire of your own. You must find the courage to step out into the rain, knowing that the journey will break you down, but it will ultimately rebuild you into something completely untouchable. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and build your own empire, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share your journey in the comments below. Made with